The Shear Truth, Chapter 1, Found Treasure. So it was Saturday, late in May. The spring was in full bloom, and warmth within the air. Hershey and I were over at Steve's house, trying to weave our way into the fort above Steve's garage. "Hey, it's getting ridiculous in here, trying to wake our way through," Hershey said. The stuff was crammed full of old, broken sports equipment, old physics lab stuff, and barely working lawn care tools. "Ow!" I yelled. "Steve, I was just gored by a rake." "Be careful, Bill. There's some really valuable and useful equipment in here," Steve said. "Like what? This old record player?" said Hershey. He pointed to a dented white metal thingy on the garage floor. "That's a centrifuge from my dad's physics lab, not a record player," Steve said, rolling his eyes. "What's it good for?" Hershey said. "You can separate liquids with it," Steve answered. "Oh, boring and useless. But what about this?" Hershey pulled a wad of steel and gears from behind some overstuffed boxes. Yes, this looks good," Hershey exclaimed. "What is it?" I asked. "A rack and pinion steering mechanism from an old lawnmower my dad scrapped," Steve explained. "That's just what we need for a race car. The rope mechanism we have sucks. If we could use this, a real steering system, we could be the fastest and win the MDM Cup," Hershey said. "It'd be pretty hard to install, but turning wheels instead of an axle drive on our go-kart could be a game changer," Steve agreed. We dug out the mechanism and Steve and Hershey examined it. Steve measured the width, and then measured the width of our race car. "It looks a little big, don't you think, Steve?" I think we can make the axle part work," Steve explained, "but the steering wheel is going to be a problem." "Why not just use the one off the old tractor?" I wondered. Steve and Hershey dragged the old steering wheel out of the garage. Steve attached the bottom of the steering wheel hub to the rack and pinion mechanism. You'd have to steer from the back bumper," Hershey laughed. "Just take the bottom thingy off and we'll be fine," I said. Steve examined the bottom. "No way. I think the thingy, Bill, is welded. Let's ask my dad." Steve went inside, and after a couple minutes, Mr. Sutter came out with him. He examined the steering wheel, the rack and pinion axle, and then Mr. Sutter went over to look at our go-kart. "Well, my suggestion would be to cut the steering column above the hub, shorten the shaft, and reattach it with the bottom gears. Then you'd be all set," Mr. Sutter explained. "Dad, well, we may be able to cut the steering column and shorten it with a hacksaw, but how do you suppose we reattach the gears?" Steve asked. "Oh, it needs to be welded. Take it down to Brubaker's Auto Body. They could weld it in 5 minutes," Mr. Sutter said. "They'd do that for us?" I said. "For $10 or so they would," Mr. Sutter chortled. We all hung our heads. We didn't have $10. We had no prospects to get $10 either by earning it or borrowing it. "I guess we'll have to think of something else," Steve said. Chapter 2, Dad Says Okay. A couple days later, Hershey and I were playing in my parents' hay fort. Hershey asked me, "What does your mom do with all the wool from the sheep?" "Well, half she gives to the Amish guy who shears them, and half she sells to Mrs. Patterson, who makes it into yarn," I said. "How much does Mrs. Patterson pay for it?" Hershey asked. "Well, I don't know." "Let's hike over to her house and ask," Hershey said. "Why?" "To make money, of course," said Hershey. "We could shear a couple sheep, sell the wool, and voila, one steering wheel welded." "I'm not sure my mom would agree to it. I know she likes when I show initiative to make my own money, but it's also taking money out of her pocket," I said. "So ask your dad. He's not a money guy. Just tell him you want to shear a couple sheep. Don't tell him about the whole thing. Sometimes less is more." That seems reasonable, I thought. "Okay, let's go." I went up to the house and found my dad working in his office. I knocked on the door. My dad didn't answer. I put my hand up and motioned for Hershey to wait outside his office. I opened the door and saw my dad sketching frantically. He didn't even notice as I walked over and sat on his leather sofa. After 5 minutes, I'd plunged deeply into the leathery softness of the sofa. He hadn't even acknowledged I was there. "Dad," I said. He looked up. "Bill, when did you get home from school?" Dad, it's Saturday." "Oh, well, go out and play in the fresh air then." My dad looked down and started sketching again. Dad, B-A-D, I half shouted. My dad looked up again, annoyed. "Bill, I have to get this building designed by next week. I thought I sent you outside." He went back to his work. "Dad, do you mind if I get some wool off a couple sheep?" "Sure, Bill. Go outside and do that," he said without looking up from his sketch. I turned back to Hershey, who was peeking around the door at me, and gave him a thumbs up. "Thanks, Dad," I said, and he mumbled something, probably about the building he was sketching. Back outside, Hershey gave me a high five. Awesome! Then he looked at me all serious and laid out our 2 remaining problems. Well, 1, we don't exactly know how to shear sheep. And 2, Mrs. Patterson might not be so good to sell to. She might tell your mom you sold her wool next time she sees her. We should try to find another buyer. Oh, and there's more. 3, we don't have any shears. And finally, what about Bucky? He probably doesn't want us messing with his flock. I nodded. I was worried about Bucky, too. That sheep was a menace. I'd been bucked in the butt so many times by him I was getting a callous gluteus maximus. Well, I think I can solve these problems, I said. I've watched the Amishmen shear the sheep for a couple years. I've even helped them, and it doesn't seem that hard. And 2, Mrs. Weaver has a spinning wheel. I've seen her spinning wool into yarn. Let's see if she'd be interested in some raw wool. And 3rd, I know where the sheep shears are. They're on the upper shelf of the tool shed. Lastly, Bucky is a problem. But maybe we can trap him with the other sheep over in the west yard and close the gate before we get started. Wow. Hershey looked at me a little dumbfounded. Bill, those are really good solutions. Your thinking has improved. I knew it, too. I felt a little tingly inside that I'd done such a good job with the solutions. We went down to the barn, and I found the shears in the tool shed, and we practiced shearing our leg hairs. Then we sheared an old carpet, and finally we sheared our sheepdog Duffy. Duffy didn't want to be sheared, so we just let him lick peanut butter, and we only did his legs so my parents wouldn't notice. He looked a little sheep-like afterwards, with spindly legs and all, with a furry body. Bill, it's time to shear some sheep. How are we going to trap them? You're the expert, and you're on a roll, Hershey said. Let's try to open the west pen gate. Then the 2 of us herd the sheep over there. Simple. Chapter 3. What about Bucky? What about Bucky? Hershey worried. Bucky was the flock's ram. Protective, mean, and sneaky. A real terrorist of a ram. Never turn your back on him, and you'll be fine, I said confidently. But I wasn't confident. I was terrified of him. He had ram-butted me countless times. Besides, once we're in the shearing pen, we'll close the gate to the shearing pen, and Bucky will be locked out. Okay, then. You hold the sheep still, and I'll shear, I said. I showed Hershey how to hold the sheep around the waist and lean back, lifting the sheep's legs off the ground. I told him to whisper calming sheepy things in their ears. A good sheepy, sheepy, sheepy. Lastly, I laid out a blanket in the shearing pen to catch all the wool. I think we're ready to shear some sheep, I said, hopefully. We sneaked into the meadow to find the sheep. I pointed. Oh, cool, I whispered. It's Marianne. She's a sweetie of a lamb, and she's all alone. Let's grab her and get to the shearing pen. What about the west gate? Hershey asked. Oh, we'll be fine in the shearing pen, I replied. Hershey and I crept towards her slowly and silently, and when she finally noticed us, she was too late. She was trapped between us, and with a lunge to the left and a slide to the right, we eased her along the fence and through the gate into the shearing pen. Yes! We closed the gate, and I jeered. I looked around, and no Bucky. Hershey, quick, get the shears. Marianne tried to run, but my surprise burst was right on, and I grabbed her and pinned her to the ground. Hershey came running back with the shears. Hershey, grab her around the waist and lean back. Hershey picked up Marianne and leaned just as I said. I let go of Marianne and grabbed the shears. I turned on the shears, and with a whir, I was off. I started in the middle and striped that sheep right down the middle in a big circle around her belly. Just as I started the second pass, I heard the jarring bang. Startled, I looked back at the gate of the shearing pen, and there was Bucky, pounding his menacing head against the gate. What the? I stammered. Another pound, and the gate rattled hard. I breathed deep to steady myself. He can't get through the gate, I thought. I turned back to Marianne. She was just a single striped shear around the waist. Hold her tight, Hershey. We need to get this done. I leaned in and started the second pass. I heard a tremendous smash, and I looked over to see Bucky on the ground with his gate smashed through. Bucky quickly scrambled up to his feet, shook his massive head to clear the cobwebs. His flockmate, Marianne, bleated, "Help! Ma!" Bucky ran towards us like we were evil sheep-doers, and we must pay with a butt-smashing. Hershey let go of Marianne and quickly hopped over the fence. Panicked, I dropped the shears and ran for the fence too. As I climbed, he smashed the fence just below my feet, rattling the fence so hard that I nearly tumbled back into the pen. I was terrified, but I didn't fall, and I climbed to safety. I looked at Hershey. That was close, he stammered. Yeah, I heaved. Bucky flailed around the pen, and Marianne escaped. Bucky turned and stared us down on the other side of the fence. "Man, that's one mean sheep, Bill," Hershey said. Just then, Bucky launched across the pen and pounded into the fence right in front of Hershey and I. Bucky then went over to the wool we had sheared off Mary Ann's midsection on the blanket and trampled on it rhythmically, back and forth, tottering and stomping it into the ground. Then Bucky trotted off triumphant. Even though he hit the fence and not me, I fell over at a stunning blow. "He is one mean sheep." "He's not a mean sheep. He's a psychopath," I said. Finally, Bucky marched away out the gate, snuffled a stunned Mary Ann in the meadow. I leaned into the pen and grabbed the few strands of wool still usable after Bucky's trampling. "Bust," I mumbled. "Bill, one setback does not make a bust," Hershey said confidently. "What? I think we're done," I groaned. "Do you think anyone will notice the shear stripe around Mary Ann?" "Bill, you're looking at a tree instead of at the forest," Hershey explained. "Bust," I repeated. Chapter 4. Frolic. "Bill, it's get some wool, or we're doomed on the cart. I can't let Chuck win again," Hershey said. "Hey, I don't want to get mauled again by that menace of an animal," I retorted. "Look, Bill, what we need is a more foolproof plan. How hard can it be to trick a sheep, especially an extremely dumb one like Bucky?" Hershey laughed. I looked at Hershey sideways. "He may be stupid, and he may be dumb, but he's strong and tenacious." I know you'll come up with something, Bill. You know sheep," Hershey said. "Fine. Let me think," I sighed. I sat in the grass and closed my eyes and thought. Meanwhile, Hershey sat down beside me and picked up some grass and tried to whistle. "Quiet! I'm trying to think," I grumped. "Sorry, Bill. Think away in peace." After a few minutes, I blurted my idea out. "Okay, I got it. We need to divert him far away. He loves sugar cubes, so we'll lure him over to the east yard, where we'll put a whole pile of sugar cubes. Then we'll double lock the eastern gate." "Awesome, Bill. Let's do it," Hershey answered. My plan worked perfectly, as the sugar cubes led Bucky towards the eastern yard. Once through, I quickly closed the gate and grabbed a chain and double-locked the gate. "He's not banging through that," I chided. Hershey and I rushed back towards our shearing pen. "Let's get Frolic. She's gentle, and she needs sheared," I said. I grabbed an extra sugar cube out of my pocket and quickly led Frolic into the shearing pen. "Yes," I thought. Hershey and I grabbed Frolic and he tilted her back off her feet. She was such a pretty sheep, so innocent and young. "Her wool will be extra valuable since it's so clean," I shouted. I named her Frolic because she always innocently bounced around the meadow. I grabbed the shears and started in. I was psyched and frenetic. Just get it done. Shear this sheep as fast as possible, I thought. I glanced at Frolic's eyes. They were wild, terrified, betrayed. A serious pang of guilt rang through my body. I heaved on and kept shearing. The first whack that caught my ear was confusing. It was hard to tell its origin or its success. Hearing the bang, Frolic gave a little "Meh." That's when the thunderous bang happened. Then I heard the stomping across the meadow growing louder and louder, nearer and nearer. Steve later told me that he heard the second bang all the way over in Media. Frolic let out a little helpless "Bah!" It was all too crazy. I looked at Hershey and he just nodded, so I continued to shear Frolic. Seconds later, another horrifying crash came. I looked up and 20 feet away was Bucky in the shearing pen. He was in the pen with Frolic, Hershey, and I. I just finished shaving the right side of Frolic. Bucky stared. His evil stare. I gulped. "Hershey, we're going to get it." "Bill, follow my lead," Hershey said. And with that, he turned and rushed the fence of the shearing pen, flipped his foot over with a graceful jump, and cleared the fence by a few inches. I looked over at Bucky's menacing stare. "Good, Bucky. I'm letting Frolic go. I just gave her a little trim." I eased towards the fence and Hershey. Bucky stared and stomped the ground. I was terrified, but I slowly eased over to the fence, farther away from Bucky. Closer and closer I got to the fence. Bucky stomped again as I reached the fence and put my hand on the top rail, getting ready to jump. In one quick moment I made my move. I sprung up. I would clear the fence to freedom. Yes! I whispered, excited as I escaped. My leap was good and high enough to clear the fence, but I hadn't counted on Bucky's persistence. Seeing me trying to escape, he raced towards me and jumped and pounded my foot just hard enough to spin me around and not land clear over the fence, but to land on it, spread eagle, square on, squashing my nards. My mind went from elation to horror and pain. The pain was so intense my eyes only saw the veins inside my eyeballs. I teetered and tottered on the fence. Bucky pounded the fence with his horns, and I lost my balance, falling sideways into the pen. Bucky pounced on my fallen body, prodding his horn head at me. "Lay flat, Bill, then he can't buck you," Hershey said from the safe side of the fence. I lay flat on the ground, my groin still throbbing. Bucky paced around me, pushing my sides with his horns. Bucky was clearly irritated. He could not punish me for shearing frolic. Bucky stomped his paw, the way he stomped his paw at me every day at dinner. I stared at him and nodded. "Extra feed tonight, goof buddy." Bucky snorted, ran over, straddled me, and started stomping front to back on either side of my body, occasionally painfully stomping on a stray finger or stray toe. After what felt like eternity, I shouted. I heard shouting from the flattened gate. "Hey, stupid sheep! You can't get me!" Hershey yelled. Bucky turned and saw Hershey, and before he left, he snorted and he peed on me. He then went after Hershey, who quickly and gracefully hopped over the fence again. Chapter 5. Dad says a bad word. We went into my bedroom and with the small remains of the wool we caught in our blanket. "Not enough wool, Bill," Hershey sighed. There was a knock on my door. "Bill, I need to talk to you about the sheep," my dad called through the door. I glanced worriedly at Hershey. Hershey waved for me to open the door. My dad stepped in. "Bill, what happened to the sheep?" "I just saw some crazy sheared sheep, and I assume you had something to do with this, son." "I asked Dad," I whined. "No way, Bill. Who did you ask?" my dad grumped. "You. I asked you a couple hours ago," I said. "What are you talking about?" my dad sneered. I turned to Hershey. "Tell him you were there." "Mr. Lynch, Bill came into your office a couple hours ago, and I heard him ask if we could shear some sheep. You replied, 'Sure, Bill,'" Hershey said. My dad always believed every word Hershey spoke. My word, on the other hand, was unreliable. My dad closed his eyes and breathed heavily. "Okay, I'll take your word, Hershey, but we have a problem. If Mrs. Lynch sees those crazy-looking sheep, there will be hell to pay." "Dad, that's a bad word," I scolded. My dad gave me a sideways glance. "Bill, if your mother sees those half-sheared sheep, you're going to hear a lot of bad words," Dad said. "What happened anyway?" "Bucky happened, Dad. He is a menace." "Really? He never bothers me," my dad replied. "Well, you're 3 times the size of him. I'm not." "Bill, just go get the shears. The 3 of us will shear the rest of the wool off those mangled sheep." "How many is there?" Dad asked. "Just 2. And Duffy's legs." "The dog? Have you no sense, Bill?" We walked down to the meadow, and my dad grabbed the shears. "Go fetch the sheep, boys," he yelled. Hershey and I ran into the meadow. "What's the plan, Bill?" Hershey wondered. I was a little flustered. I looked around and saw Mary Ann grazing nearby. "Her! Let's fix her first." I sneaked up and grabbed her. And I'll sneak up and grab her, and you open the gate, I explained. Hershey gave me a thumbs up, and I nonchalantly walked over to Mary Ann. "Good girl. Sorry I sheared you, such a good little sheepy I cooed." Mary Ann looked up and made eye contact. I repeated, "Good little sheepy. Bill, help little sheepy." Mary Ann didn't run. I was able to grab her around the waist and lift her up, and with all my might, start towards my dad in the shearing pen. Hershey ran in front and pulled the gate open and closed it quickly after I carried Mary Ann through. I was teetering at this point. Even a small sheep like Mary Ann was a lot for me to carry. I tumbled forward, and just as I got to my dad, it was then I heard Hershey scream, "Ow!" I turned, and Hershey was face down outside the gate, and Bucky was doing his victory hop. Hershey crawled under the gate and stood slowly and solemnly, and then he limped over to me and my dad. "I didn't see that one coming." "Are you okay?" I asked. "Well, I may not sit down for a while." Now I know why you think that sheep is a menace, Hershey huffed. Boys, we got work to do. Bill, hold the sheep still, so I can shear it, my dad grumped. I held on tight, and my dad sheared Mary Ann clean. After that, we caught Frolic and sheared her too. When we were done, we had a pile of wool. Get rid of this wool, Bill. I don't want to see or hear a word of what happened here today, ever again. Dad stared at me. Ever. Do you hear me? I nodded, and Hershey and I picked up the wool and packed it in a burlap bag. Now what? I asked Hershey. Hershey rubbed his hands together. The payoff, he said. Chapter 6. I think of Swedish fish a lot. We carried the wool across the golf course past the pool. Hershey was especially chatty, but he was also limpid quite a bit. You okay, Hershey? I asked. Yeah, I'm fine. Sore keister, though. When we got to Mrs. Weaver's house, Hershey knocked on the door, and Chuck's little sister Greta opened the door. Chuck's not here, she growled, and went to slam the door. Wait, said Hershey. We're here to see your mom. Greta cracked the door open. Why? We want to see if she wants to buy some wool, Hershey explained. Why? Greta repeated. Well, doesn't she spin wool on her spinning wheel? Hershey answered. Why? I don't know why your mom spins wool. But can we see her? Mom! Hershey and Bill want to see you, Greta called loudly. And with that, she left and went upstairs. Mrs. Weaver came out of the kitchen in a cooking apron and gave us the busy look. Hello, Hershey and Bill. What can I do for you? Mrs. Weaver, we were wondering if you'd be in the market for a fine bag of wool, just sheared by Bill's dad and us. Some of it's the finest lamb's wool you may ever see, Hershey offered. Since when are you boys in the wool selling business? Well, we're looking for some cash so we can finish our race car. Not the MDM Cup again. Is that all you boys ever think of? Mrs. Weaver asked. No, I actually think of Swedish fish a lot too, I joked. Hershey handed the burlap bag over to Mrs. Weaver for inspection, and she felt through the bag thoroughly for a couple minutes. She pursed her lips and said, I'll give you $5 for the whole bag. The only really good stuff is the lamb's wool. The price is actually $10, Hershey said. Maybe if it were all lamb, but that's way too much. I'm sorry, Mrs. Weaver said. Why do you need $10 anyway? That's a big investment for a race. Well, Mrs. Weaver, we want to install a new steering system in our car. Chuck beats us every year, I said. I know Chuck wins every year. Chuck talks non-stop about how great a race car driver is. He thinks he's going to win the Indianapolis 500 one day. Mrs. Weaver groaned, but she kept feeling through the wool bag. Okay, I'll give you $10, but you boys better beat him in the race. Chapter 7. Fool's Gold. We left Gideon happy and hopeful, but Hershey was still limping. Mr. Sutter drove Steve, Hershey, and I down to Brubaker's auto body to get the steering wheel welded. Mr. Brubaker examined the steering column and grunted a few times. Finally he said, Sorry, boys, it's going to cost $20 to weld this. I need an extra $10 because it's stainless steel to ferric steel, and that requires sulfur dioxide, which is really expensive. I drooped externally and internally. We only have $10, Mr. Brubaker. Mr. Sutter quickly asked, Hey, any of you boys got any monkey gold? It's mostly sulfur dioxide, an excellent substitute, and I could help you transmutate a couple ounces to help you make the weld. Everyone looked at Hershey. We knew he was the monkey gold fiend. He'd trade anything for monkey gold, even Swedish fish. No way, guys! I can't spare any! Not for $10, not for a race car. Leave my monkey gold alone! Steve cocked his head and stared at Hershey. Really? That's just a couple ounces? That's half my hoard, and ever since they repaved Media, we haven't found any more. My monkey gold is irreplaceable, Hershey whined. Hershey, if the world valued a fun community race above hoarded gold, it would be a funner and more peaceful world, Steve chided. Hershey shook his head violently back and forth. Not my monkey! Not my monkey! Not my monkey gold! Steve replied. You know I'm correct. No, get your own monkey gold! But Hershey's head started to slow, until finally it settled straight, and Hershey looked dead-eyed at Steve and huffed. You're exactly wrong! But I'll get my monkey gold. Back in the Sutter's basement, Mr. Sutter was amazing. He didn't actually melt the monkey gold. Apparently you can't. But he transmutated it into sulfur dioxide perfectly. A perfectly prepared mixture for Mr. Brubaker. Afterwards, Mr. Sutter drove us back to Brubaker's auto body. Mr. Brubaker brought us these crazy helmets with these little dark slitted eye holes to look through. "Boys, put these on and watch me welding." It was a crazy inferno of white flashes and sparking and lightning, and suddenly he was done. It was welded. "I only used half the sulfur dioxide solution Phil made, so I'll tell you what. Let me keep the rest and I'll give you a free weld next time." Hershey looked solemnly at the welding mixture. "Can you turn it back into monkey gold?" he sighed. "Only if I were God," Mr. Sutter said. Another sigh, and a huff, and a shake of the head. And Hershey said, "Let's get going. We got a race to win." We installed the new steering system that afternoon, as the race was tomorrow. It wasn't easy figuring out how to get it installed, and we worked hard. Steve designed the system, and I installed it. Hershey helped, but it was mostly for finding tools and moral support. When we finished, Hershey looked me dead in the eye and said, "Bill, I feel like my tailbone has been ripped from my back. Bucky has my butt still aching. You're going to need to be the driver. I'm not sure I can sit in the car," Hershey said solemnly. "Are you kidding me? I can't drive that go-kart. That's your thing." "Bill, you have to. This is your dream. My vision. We have to run this race. You have to run this race." "Take a deep breath and say yes," Hershey finished. I breathed deep and thought hard. I knew I wasn't a very good driver, but maybe a new steering wheel would change all that. After a second deep breath, I nodded. It was late, but I wanted to get in a test run, so we pushed the car halfway up Mackin Avenue for a short run. Even on the shallow part of Mackin Avenue, I was unable to control the car very well. At the finish, I screamed, "This car's a death trap, Hershey!" "Bill, you need to let the wheels do the work. Let it roll through the corners. Lay off the brakes. In this machine, breaking through the corners is a suicide slide." I left with a plan to practice another run in the morning. I went home worried. Very worried. After a couple hours of tossing and turning in my bed, I fell asleep, only to awake late. I biked over to Steve's house to find them tinkering on the race car. "Bill, you're late," Hershey said. "We missed our morning practice window. The first heats are in 20 minutes, Steve said." Frank and Steve helped push the car up to the start, as Hershey was too sore to push. "I'm going to stay here on Dale. And remember, let the wheels do the work, not the brakes," Hershey reminded me. Chapter 8. Allen's Folly. The MDM Cup. The MDM Cup was a race first run in the 1960s. It was pretty unofficial until 1969, when Steve's brother Allen made a trophy, set the race rules. The trophy was a coffee cup with a styrofoam comb on the top, and all of it covered in tinfoil. He called it a replica of the command module from Apollo 11, and he inscribed it in black Sharpie marker with the date of the first race, July 20th, 1969. And then he'd inscribe the winners of the race each year below. The winner got to keep the cup for a whole year until the next race. The race started at the top of Media Avenue, near Hill Street. A gentle start, but the course quickly steepened with a shallow curve at Niblick and another shallow curve at Divot Drive. By the time you got to Dale Street, you were at maximum speed for the 90-degree turn ahead. The turn was key. Gravel on Dale Street made the high-speed turn treacherous, and it was not uncommon for a racer to end up tangled in the long limbs of the Dale Street pines. Dale Street was short and required another 90-degree turn onto the home stretch of Mackin Avenue by the Sutters, ending in front of the empty lot just past their house. I had watched a few races, and lately Chuck and Mark had dominated them. They'd tinkered with their car throughout the year, and practiced even when the streets weren't blocked off. No one thought they would beat Brian 3 years ago, but Chuck won it going away. And since then, Chuck had won 2 more times, enshrining himself as the first 3-time winner. Not only was their car fast, but Chuck was a fearless racer, able to bend his car around corners, sliding effortlessly on the gravel like a seasoned dirt track racer. And Mark, he was a great car designer, able to make it fast and sleek. Chapter 9. Crash and Burn. On the first heat, Chuck easily beat Brian Moore again. I was up next against Frank Wint. Frank got hung up on the start, though, so I was way ahead by the time we got to the Dale Street corner. I was able to brake and slow before the corner and ease in and out of the turn and cruise to victory. Frank, Steve, and Hershey were cheering for me at the finish line. After the race, Hershey put his arm around me. "Bill, you did a great job, but Chuck will eat you up if you slow down before the curve. Trust the steering." "Hershey, that thing was flying at the bottom of Media Avenue Hill. There's no way to make that turn at full speed," I whined. Steve looked at me sternly. "Bill, the whole point of rack and pinion steering is to ride the curve. The rack and pinion steering lowers the coefficient of friction." "Yeah, well, physics isn't going to die if I crash," I retorted. "Bill, I gave half my gold to have that steering wheel welded. You have to drive this for me. If I could, I'd be racing. But I have faith in that race car. And more important, I have faith in you," Hershey said. "I don't know, Hershey. I'm not a very good driver," I moaned. "We installed a game changer, and I believe you're better than you think. Do it, Bill. Do it for me. But also do it for the sheep." Frank nudged Hershey. "The sheep? Really, Hershey? Is that the best inspiration you got?" Hershey sighed. "Hey, it's time to get the race car pushed to the top." Steve and Hershey pushed the race car back up. I looked around. At least 20 kids and a couple of moms from the neighborhood were gathered around the finish line. Mrs. Weaver whispered to me, "Good luck, Bill," as we pushed the car past her. At the top of Media Avenue, a few more kids had gathered around the starting line near Allen. "Come on, Frank, Steve, get that car up here. We can't block off Media Avenue forever," Allen said. "1 minute till we start." I crawled in the race car and tested the steering wheel, turning it right and then left. It turned free and easy, just like Hershey promised. I looked beside me. Chuck was in his race car, sleek, silver, and shiny, with Chuck wearing his red Mario Andretti ascot. "Oh, good luck, Chuck," I said. Chuck pulled his goggles over his eyes and calmly said, "Crash and burn, Lynch." I winced and looked at Steve, who shrugged. "Okay, this is for the finals. This is the final of the MDM Cup. I have a Sharpie whose name will be on it this year," Allen said. "Get on with it, Sutter. I guarantee victory, so wave the flag," Chuck said. Allen, a little flustered, started the race. "On your marks, get set, go!" Allen screamed. I took a deep breath and let go of the brake, and Chuck was ahead quickly. I guess the deep breath was a bad idea. I blinked for focus. Chuck was just ahead on the shallow curve as Niblick approached. Chuck wrenched his obsolete wheel to the left, wheeling his car around the curve. I was able to close in as I glided my rack and pinion steering around the corner, gaining speed all the way. "Ride those curves, you're doing great!" I heard Steve yell just as I approached the divot turn. Just a subtle turn, I thought, and I bore down on Chuck's race car. I had speed. I was flying. Chuck veered wide on the curve, trying to block me, but I easily cut and side and flew around him with my superior steering. "Wow, I'm in the lead," I thought. "I'm going to win!" My speed was tremendous as I was approaching Dale Street. I turned my head back and saw I was several car lengths ahead. My mind raced faster and faster, just like my race car. "Bill," I thought, "slow it down, and you'll still win, just like last time." I pushed lightly on the brake as I approached Dale Street. "Ooh-yah!" Chuck screamed, closing fast. He was approaching the curve with breakneck speed. In a panic, I released the brake and jammed the wheel clockwise. I glanced over my right shoulder and saw Chuck sliding inside me. "Keep calm," I thought. "Use the force of the wheel. Bill, just control your turns," I thought. I turned even harder through the middle of the turn, but I wrenched a bit too far, and maybe Chuck drifted and slid into me too much, and Chuck's front left wheel glanced my right wheel. In a flash, I jammed the brakes to gain control, but I was in a suicide slide as I spun out of control towards the dreaded Dale Street Pines. "Ah!" I screamed. I lost complete control of the car, slamming sideways through the branches, crunching through the limbs, fury of mayhem, snapping and scratching through limbs as I heard a thunderous metallic snap. Finally, the car sidled to a stop against one of the large branches near the base of the tree. I was scratched. I was pine-sapped. I looked around, awestruck by the darkness and the confinement under the pines. Feeling claustrophobic and trapped, I fussed to untie my rope seatbelt and groggily crawled out of the car on my belly. Chapter 10. Unexpected Treasure. Under the tree, I came out of the shock of the crash. I felt claustrophobic and trapped. I fussed to untie my rope seatbelt, and groggily, I crawled out of the car on my belly. The branches kept scratching my back as the gravel scuffed my belly raw. Finally, I peered out from under the tree branches, and Steve and Hershey came running up Dale Street. "Are you okay?" Hershey called. I huffed. "I survived, but that car is a death trap. When I turned, the axle broke, probably because of that cheap weld." It seems fairly unlikely that a steel weld would break on such an easy turn, Steve wondered. "Easy turn? Hershey called it a suicide slide earlier," I whined. "Maybe it broke when Chuck rammed me." "I was pretty far away, but Chuck just seemed to tap your rear wheel," Steve said. Look, just look at that thing. The thing ain't broken." I stood and pointed to the race car wrapped around the tree. "You mean the axle?" Just then, cheering erupted on Mackin Avenue. I looked over and saw Chuck doing a victory dance with Mark. I sighed a deep breath. "You know, if Hershey was driving, maybe the weld would have held," I moaned. "What's that glistening on your stomach?" Hershey pointed. I looked down confused and pulled 2 small pieces of monkey gold that were embedded in my stomach skin. "See? I told you the weld failed. Mr. Brubaker didn't even use all of Hershey's monkey gold. This is from the car's weld," I huffed. Hershey ignored my rant and started boring his way through the limbs of the Dale Street pines. "Steve, go get me a rope. We need to pull this car out of the tree," Hershey called from under the tree. Steve ran home and returned quickly with an orange electrical cord. "I couldn't find a rope, but this'll do," he said. Hershey tied the electrical cord off to the back wheel and crawled out with the other end of the cord. "Grab on, guys, and pull." With great effort, we dragged the car out. Hershey pointed, but I already saw, and by the look on Steve's face, he saw too. We all stared. In front of the tires was gravel that was piled behind the tires as we had dragged the car out from under the tree. The gravel glistened gold. "Monkey gold," Hershey whisper screamed. He immediately collected several pieces from the sides of the tires. "Man, where'd that come from?" I asked. "Under the tree," Steve suggested. We immediately got down on our knees and then our stomachs and began crawling under the godforsaken limbs of the Dale Street pines. About halfway in, Hershey gasped. "It's some other load, dudes. These limbs must have grown over the road, and when it was repaved, they didn't cut back the branches which covered the side of the road. Because of these limbs, they left the old road pristine with monkey gold." There was monkey gold in the gravel, and there was monkey gold in the pavement. Hershey's eyes were shining. "This is freaking awesome!" Suddenly we heard voices. It was Chuck's. "Hey, Bill, are you going to congratulate me on my awesome victory, or are you going to sulk under that tree all day?" Hershey froze. I froze. Steve scratched his nose and said, "Shh." Chapter 11. Elevator button. Hershey pointed vehemently for us to exit and put his fingers to his lips. We crawled out. "What are you guys up to?" Mark asked. "Oh, just checking out the crash scene," Hershey explained. "Let me congratulate you on a great race. The way you were able to pass Bill showed incredible racing prowess," Steve said. "Well, I didn't exactly crash him," Chuck laughed. "He crashed." The fastest does not always win the race, but he'll always be the fastest, and you'll always be the winner. Maybe next year we'll beat you, Hershey said. "Only if the polar ice caps melt," replied Chuck. He turned and sauntered away down Putter Avenue with Mark. Chuck and Mark were clearly basking in their victory. "I can't wait to tell my mom. She'll be so proud. She'll want to hear the story of my victory over and over again all night," Chuck chuckled. Hershey rolled his eyes. "They are so full of themselves." Steve turned his attention back to the car. "Bill, it looks like you braked, and during the slide, or when Chuck bumped you, the weld broke." "No way! The weld broke during the turn, causing me to slide. I'm telling you, it was a faulty weld," I argued back. Hershey tapped his chin. "Guys, Are you really going to argue about a silly race? Win or lose, that race rocked. And in the most serendipitous moment, we found the mother lode of monkey gold. I mean, we haven't found monkey gold in media for like ever. 2 years. Even better, this is a monkey gold mine that only we know about. Let's keep it that way. And go up to Steve's fort and celebrate with a no-rules rumpus session. Afterwards, we can plan when to come back and mine this gold and get rich. I looked at Hershey's eyes gleaming. I turned to Steve, his eyes soothing with the righteous look. Steve pushed the elevator button. Choop. I pushed my elevator button. Choop. Hershey thirded. Choop. And we headed up to the top floor.